Hello, Mr. Nick Howard.
What's up, guys? What's the bottom of your hat say, by the way?
Oh, it says live lucky.
Nice.
um, it's actually a Tony Robbins hat. It's strange that his hat says live lucky. Like when I went for one of the seminars, they gave it to me. So yeah, I thought it was pretty fitting for a call like this, so I decided to put it on.
Let's go.
All right, so this week we are coming back again to mindset, and I think one of the key things to think about when it comes to mindset, right, is to really understand why you're in the game of poker. Why are you playing this game of poker? Um, and what do you think are some common goals that people have in poker?
Yeah, I think it would be hard. This kind of reminds me of like if we asked everybody, "What's your goal in life?" I think we could get everybody to say, "I just want to be happy or fulfilled." I'm pretty sure we could say that everybody would agree they want to make as much money as possible if they pick up poker. So if we can all agree on that to some extent, then the question becomes, as a player who's heading into this profession, how do you put yourself on a path to make as much money as possible as quickly as possible? The two are very connected, I would say. And the reason they're connected is because in poker, the way everything is structured is that you can move up stakes. So realistically, your goal, if you want to make the most money, should be to put yourself on a path where you can move up in stakes as efficiently as possible and be beating higher stakes once you get there. So that kind of brings us into two topics that overlap: bankroll management and how are you going to get better at the game, and basically how much are you going to study compared to how much you're going to play. Which one do you want to go into first, Wayne?
Well, before we jump into that, right? I personally I don't think it's that fair to just say that everybody is in poker to make as much money as possible. Um, a lot
That's
of
true.
people come to poker and they say, "Hey, I want to be the best player possible. I'm just like in love with the game. I don't really care so much about the money." That's one kind of people that don't fit into the category. The second kind of person that don't fit into the category is somebody that just wants to make a living. They want to be the best 2-5 player. They want to be the best 5-10 player in their casino and make like 10K a month. They don't want to play too many hours. They don't want to work too hard. They just want to be comfortable. And
I think that's fair. I think those types of players are definitely out there. Um, I think I could poke holes in them in terms of the logic behind it. I won't, because I think that's a whole nother video. I do think the guy who's coming from a place where he just really loves the game, I think that's a very healthy uh, motivation. I would hope that guy already has other funds, or maybe he's just already financially secure. That's why he's into it that way. Um, but I mean, yeah, for the people that are treating it as a business, that want to get the most out of their business, I would say a fair goal would be to move up in stakes efficiently and stay there at high stakes. Not necessarily the best in the world, but at a very competitive level.
well, I'd say that in order for us to cover this topic most efficiently, we at least need to cover this for two kinds of audience. The first is somebody that wants to be a professional, that really wants to, make big money in poker. And the second is like a recreational player that just wants to become better than their friends and as good as possible while still doing something else full time.
Sure. So I think that leads right into the difference between those two people, or how much are they going to study, in my
Mm.
opinion. Um, I think if you mapped out the trajectory of the two players you just described, you're going to find that the recreational player differs mainly in the sense that he's not putting in as much work off the tables as the other guy. Assuming that they're both playing, a decent amount, I think who studies more is going to be the deciding factor. I just don't see how it could be anything else, really, because where else is the skill coming from?
Well,
That
it's
was
not
that
just
was a
about
rhetorical question.
It's not just about how many hours you put into the study, right? It's also about how you choose your study and what
Yeah,
kind of studying you're doing.
assuming they're studying well, assuming that they're, learning from content that's consistent and relatively accurate. I think that the guy that studies more, the guy that outworks the other guy is always going to end up on top. But yeah, it's a good point. Like there's been times in my career where I was working really hard in the wrong direction. That's saying like you can run as fast as possible, but if you're running east looking for a sunset, it's not going to work. I'm not sure if I just butchered that. I think the sun sets in the west.
I think the lesson here that comes to mind for me is that firstly we need to know where we are at, and I mean there's a quote that always goes out, right? I can't remember who it comes from, but even if you know the direction you're running, if you don't know where you are, you're never gonna get to the right destination. Like you can't map out the right destination. You have to know where you are on the map first. And with regards to how this ties into the point that we are discussing, is that you have to know what your objective in poker is. You have to know if your objective is to make as much money in poker as possible, being a professional poker player, or if your objective in poker is just to, be good enough to beat your friends in a home game, and you want to keep working in your business, or you want to keep working in a bank or whatever it is. But really, I think there's two very distinct trajectories in terms of how many hours you should put into your studying and different paths for your study. If you are somebody that just wants to be kind of okay at poker, pretty good, you can beat most of your friends. Like it makes a lot of sense to be really good at the basics and to understand how you can play well against people that don't know how to play poker so well. If you are an aspiring pro, your path here is to try and get to high stakes as fast as possible, because that's where all the money is at. So when we map out these two different paths, there is two different learning paths as well, and two different ratios for how much you should study and play. And if we talk about the recreational player one first, where maybe a recreational player is not you want to be a really good amateur player. How would you recommend somebody go about this path, Nick?
Define amateur. Wins at his local live casino.
All right. I'd say that you want to win in your local live casino. You have another form of income, whether that's a business or
Sure. I think you need to get to a place where so in the levels here, let's say there's 3 levels of knowledge, just to make it really simple. Level 1, 2, and 3, where level 3 knowledge is what you need to get to high stakes. Level 2 knowledge is what you need to be an amateur. Level 1 knowledge is what you need to beat your local home game, much more novice. What we're talking about here is probably like level 2, I would say. And for that, I think you need a very consistent understanding of base principles. You don't need to know anything like super advanced, but you do need to have a solid grip on how the structure of the game works. Stuff like what your starting ranges are, generally what your stack off requirements are in certain spots, how certain portions of your range play best as a general principle. A lot of that stuff we talked about here just as basics. But I think where the rubber really meets the road for the amateur is he stays really consistent with it. And that's why I think it needs to be well integrated, because a lot of guys would be able to tell you the right answer away from the table. But when they get to the table, something happens under the performance pressure where they don't stay consistent with what they know. So I think that's a big point, is like you need to be integrated enough through your studies that it's almost automatic for you when you get to the tables. The general principles for you are just very easy to apply. So it's that middle ground between like, I don't know anything too advanced, but the things I know very well, and I don't deviate from them. I think that's the amateur level. And that just requires that you have a good grasp on whatever methodology you're studying, and that you've been able to sort of translate it into heuristics or rules of thumb that apply when you go sit down and play. If it's too abstract, you're not going to be able to really implement it well. So I think it needs to be something practical and concrete. I like to use this word heuristic because I just think it's the best that we have in the English language for what I'm talking about. But, basically finding rules of thumb that are going to lead you to the right decision 80% of the time. That Pareto principle. Like, this isn't perfect, but this thing, if I always call with top pair in this spot, for instance, that's 80% of the time going to be a correct decision. So it's stuff like that I think the amateur has access to and does very well. The winning amateur, at least. Solid strategy. That's nothing special, but that he doesn't deviate from, and it beats the fish at the table.
So if you had a one-on-one client, one-on-one student that was learning from you, and he wanted to be this person.
Cool. Yeah.
How would you recommend him build his strategy?
I'm glad you put it that way because it reminds me of another point. We would teach him how to beat fish first. There's this, usually, my brother was just doing a study that he told me about today, and he said that like there's a filter that you can run. We have a ton of data, and it shows that when regs are at a table without a fish, usually they lose because of the rake. So if you think about like most regs are amateurs, which is probably the case, they're not even able to beat the rake unless there's a fish at the table. So that may not always be the case, but like it seems to be a trend. And if you take that to heart, what it means is like we need to be putting ourselves in situations at tables where there's weak players, and we need to know how to exploit the weak player very well. So this would be the part where I would say most of the study early on, the front-loaded work early, should be geared towards how weak players think, operate, and how we can make as much money as possible from them, because that's really that's why the amateur shows up at the table. He shows up for the fish. He's not trying to go to war with regs. His income depends on him being able to perform against a weaker player, basically.
Yeah, that brings a good point. Like, I actually think if you're an amateur player that basically wants to make money from poker and your objective is to win money, you have to be really careful about game selection. Especially if you play live. The difference between a good table and a bad table can be worlds of difference. And I'm not saying to just exclusively bum hunt or to only play when the games are good. But
basically that's what we're saying. I mean, if your goal as an amateur is to make sure you're always in the best spots for making money, then yeah, you really should probably go do something else if there's not a good game available. See, that's the biggest skill an amateur can have, in my opinion. Like, what makes an amateur able to stay in business for a long time? He's aware of his skill level and he puts himself in good spots. And the rest of what I said, he operates consistently when he does sit down at the table. But maybe, like, it's a weird thing to say, but maybe the best skill for an amateur is to learn how to table select. Because amateur compared to what? Like, we can define it roughly, but realistically, it's all relative to the table strength that he sits down at. If an amateur sits down with 7 other fish, he's a pro in terms of win rate.
yeah, well, I think the whole self-awareness part is just a crucial skill, whichever level you are at, whether you're an amateur or whether you're a pro. It's very important to know how you stand against other players and to know what are your strengths, what your weaknesses are, as well as what everybody's strengths and weaknesses are at the table, because that's the whole game of poker, right? It's about exploiting people's weaknesses with your strengths and to kind of compensate for your weaknesses, to try and cover up for them as much as possible. So, what I'm saying is that whether you are at a table with pros or with amateurs, or whether there's no pros or whether there is only recreational players, you want to be really careful about choosing a different strategy against each different player. If a pro is in a seat on your left and he's playing really aggressive, your strategy is going to be quite different. And the only way for you to play a more winning strategy is to acknowledge that some people are just going to make your life difficult, and you will have to lose some EV because they are in a certain position.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Like knowing when you can really open your game up compared to knowing when you have to really gear up and buckle down. Those are probably the two biggest advantages of being self-aware in terms of sitting down at a table with different types of opponents, because every session is really like changing. It's your strategy is not really, assuming you're an amateur, your strategy starts to change depending on the table composition, and you're trying to get in more pots with fish and you're trying to avoid good regs. So that adds another dimension into the game, which is really fun. Like once you're aware of that dynamic, you can learn how to maneuver through it. And yeah, it's frustrating to play with better players sometimes, but you're also learning. And if you're doing it right, you're getting in pots with fish often with good enough hands and hopefully running decently enough against them to beat them. But realistically, I think an amateur would have to admit that the vast majority of his income comes from the fish, and he should reverse engineer his plan around that being the outcome, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there's also a part to be said about seats at the table, where your strategy is going to change very drastically depending on where the fish sits. And if the fish is on your left and there are a lot of good players on his left, you're going to have to play a strategy that is a lot tighter than if it was the other way around. And the only way for you to adjust your strategy accurately is to really know where you stand in the food chain.
For sure.
And there's a lot about, like, you have to be quite humble and very realistic about it. I think overestimating your skills in a certain level can be very hurtful to your win rate.
I mean, I was thinking about this when you were talking about the fish and self-awareness. Like, I wonder what percentage of fish are aware that they're the fish at the table. Because I've seen both. I've seen the fish who thinks he's really great and just is completely ignorant to the fact that he's not. And I've also seen the fish who is insecure and knows that he's the fish. And if the players at the table, like one time this happened where there was a big fish in the game and one of the regs like claimed the seat to his left, which for anybody that doesn't know, that's like the unspoken language for I want to be on your left because I think you're a fish. And the fish knew this was happening. He was aware that this was happening, and he was the fish that knew that he was the fish. He was just like a very rich businessman who was there for fun. And he got really angry and upset that he was being targeted, and he stood up and he left the game. So there is that type of fish too, who like knows that he's the fish and he just is there wanting to have good fun. And he's not good, but at least he's humble enough to understand that he's not good. But I think it's like interesting to think about, like, you know, what type of fish is he? Is he the guy who is like going off the rails, you know, trying to prove something? Or is he the guy that's just kind of there donating and he's happy donating because he's got other means of income and he's just there to enjoy his vacation or whatever. You see that a ton in Vegas during the series. People are just there to sort of have a good time, and, you know, the drinks are comped and it's no big deal for them. That said, a fish is usually a fish because they don't understand the structure of the game. So both those guys are very beatable. I guess I just think it's funny, not funny, but fun and interesting to think about which type of fish is it, because it's a self-awareness question. I kind of do think that the really like arrogant fish is funny because it's kind of funny to be around when it's happening, but that's just me, and it's kind of mean. I like to see the angry fish get what he deserves sometimes. Because he's a negative influence on the table. So I'd rather play with the happy fish all day.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very, very big difference. And I mean, I played a lot live, so
especially with you, like how many times have you made friends with the happy fish, and then he's like, the networking beyond that is like awesome.
Yeah, plenty of times. And it's really about understanding what the fish's needs are. Different fish, I mean, some people just want to have fun. Some they don't mind losing, they're happy. And you talk to these people really differently. When it's an angry fish, then you need to talk to him in a different manner for him to feel like he want to be at the table more. And when we played so much live in Macau, it was always like our job to kind of entertain the fish if we wanted to play more hands with him per hour.
Mm.
And it's so the story I have here is that in Macau, a lot of the games at the highest games are mostly played by um, foreigners, so non-Chinese. There are a lot of Europeans. There are mostly Europeans actually. So nobody really speaks Mandarin or Cantonese. And then when the fish comes to the table, the fish is often pretty bored because there's no one talking to him. So as a Chinese pro at the table, if I wanted him to play a longer session, I have to talk to him and I have to understand how he communicates and why he's okay with losing money. Because most of these fish, they come, they know they're gonna lose. I mean, most of them, when they play a lot, they know that they are gonna lose in the long run. They know that everyone is a pro, but they're okay with losing certain ways and they're not okay with losing certain ways. And the
See,
only way
that's so interesting to me. Finish up. I'll say something after.
Yeah, the only way to really get them to play long is to understand how they think. And when you understand how they think and why they're at the game, it's also easier for you to construct a good winning strategy against them.
I lost my thought, but I'll get it back. You said something along the lines of, oh, they're okay. They know they're going to lose in the long run, but they're okay with it because of the chance they could win in the short. Would you agree that's what it is? Like somehow the chance that they could have a winning session seems to be more attractive to them than knowing they're going to lose in the long run. Because if they thought they were going to show up and lose every time, I don't think they would show up, right? So that's got to be that there's some chance.
Yeah, for sure.
And what I think is really interesting about that is that if you use that psychology and switch it to the reg, I was telling you about this when we were mapping a little bit of the call. I said one of the things I'm working on with my guys so much is that they're not okay with losing in the short term. So it's kind of the inverse of what you said. The fish's mentality is a player who is a winner starts to expect to win in every session. And it creates a really big mindset issue. And if you want to go even more small with it, he expects to win almost every pot, whether he wants to admit it or not. When he loses a pot, he gets upset because his mind is not able to really put in perspective how often you're actually supposed to lose hands in this game. And so I would say most of the mindset stress and tilt problems that occur come from a winning player having unrealistic expectations towards the game. And I think that's where this concept of variance comes in, and we need to sort of talk about the reality of variance and potentially what you are committing to if you want to get to the level where you're a consistent winning amateur. So I think we could talk about it in two domains. We could do internet poker and live poker. The main thing that you need to understand is that we're talking about how many hands you play. That's one factor. And then the other main factor is what is your win rate? The higher your win rate, the less your variance will be, which means you don't need to play as many hands to beat luck, basically. So that should be another reason that reinforces why you study. The better you are, the more edge you have, the less luck, the less you can be affected by bad luck over substantial sample sizes. That said, there is enough variance in the game for most average winning players that some very long stretches of unfortunate samples could occur to you. And that needs to be something you're prepared for. And there's ways to prepare for that. You can use programs to basically decide how big your bankroll needs to be in order to be safe playing the
So what's
games
a
that you're
good
playing in.
heuristic here?
Generally speaking, if you're someone who's looking to, there's a catchphrase called risk of ruin. It's the way that the standard deviation software basically calculates, it uses it in terms of less than 5% risk of ruin is the heuristic it spits out. That's generally an acceptable risk for someone who's basically, trying to move up in stakes. So generally speaking, a guy with an average win rate might need 30 buy-ins or so to have less than a 5% risk of ruin if he's got a decent win rate at his game. Now, that's for someone who's trying to move up aggressively or just moderately aggressively, because, if you're trying to move up, you aren't going to use a bankroll strategy that makes it impossible for you to ever have to move down. It would just require you to have too big of a bankroll. So this 5% risk of ruin thing is for people who are trying to move up moderately aggressively. 30 buy-in cushion seems to do the trick. The general recommendation for if it's your bread and butter game, I guess, like if you're already established at high stakes and you just want to make sure that you can stay there forever, almost like without any risk, double that, maybe a little bit more than double that is pretty much like makes you indestructible. As you get up to like 100 buy-ins, you don't really have anything to worry about as long as you have solid edge over the game. But at that point, you also need to be willing to put in a lot of hands and play consistently through a bad run. A lot of times what you see happen is somebody is a winner, but then they go on a downswing and their game shifts because they're under, they're on tilt, basically. They're unable to deal with the downswing. And now they're becoming a worse player as they're downswinging, and then their variance can go up even more because when you're not as big of a winner, downswings can occur to you more frequently or to worse extents. So this brings me back to my point that the amateur really needs to make sure that he's playing consistently no matter what happens in order to make sure that variance can't affect him. And he also needs to be willing to put in rather large samples to make sure that he can play through variance.
Well, I have a very different viewpoint, and the reason I have this viewpoint is that I think a lot of amateurs don't really, their main form of income is not from poker, right? And if we assume that their money is not kind of as separated or segregated as a professional's bankroll is, then, I mean, in reality, I don't even think professionals have their bankrolls really segregated. A lot of people just mix their life money and their poker money.
For sure. And some professionals even have diversified income too, which does change things.
Yeah. And so how would you say that changes things?
Well, that's cool that like the cool thing about this is there's a program where you can just enter it in. Like, what chance do you want there to be that you could go broke? You can choose that number. So if you don't care if you go broke with whatever bankroll you want to use, 20% of the time, it can show you exactly how many buy-ins you need for that to be the equation.
So what is this program called?
PokerDope.com has a variance calculator that you can play with, and it's really fun. I would recommend it to any player who is like getting started, just trying to map this out. Spend a couple hours playing with that thing, and I think you'll have a new perspective on what variance can do, and it'll familiarize you more with the thresholds so that you can decide what's right for you. Because you make a good point. Like for somebody who says, well, 5% risk of ruin, like I've got other money coming in. I don't need to be that safe. I can take more shots, especially if you think that you're a substantially winning player and you want to take a more aggressive model. Then yeah, you can, cut that in half if you want. I'm not sure what that would do to your risk of ruin. I think it would raise it substantially. But this program can show you pretty much exactly what you're looking at with whatever amount of risk you're willing to assume.
And so before we move on to the aspiring high stakes professional player, to wrap up the amateur kind of somebody that just wants to play part time, how much would you study if you were that person? And how would you study?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think I would do. This is because I know like what works for me, but like I never have done well playing more than 4 hours a day. So my schedule has always sort of looked like 2 hours study, 4 hours play, and toward the beginning, maybe a little bit more studying than play. Maybe more like a 1-to-1 ratio. Maybe 3 hours study, 3 hours play a day. But yeah, I would definitely urge people to do at least that 2-hour minimum if you are serious about even becoming an amateur. And then once you get to a place where you're a winning amateur, you can decide whether or not you want to keep studying, because that's really the difference between where you're headed with what's the next step if you want to go to sort of like high stakes elite. I think you could argue that the steps are the same, except the high stakes guy just keeps going further with it and starts to bite off more advanced content after a point and maybe keep studying, where the amateur might study way less once he's an established winner because he has the skills that he wants. So yeah, I was just gonna say 2 hours I think is it's to me it's like lean horse, long ride. If you're the type of guy that for 2 years straight can study 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, that to me is way more powerful than someone who claims that they're like going to be a great professional poker player and they just decided they're going to do it, and they show me their schedule and it's like they're going to play for 9 hours a day and study for 6 and sleep for, however many hours the day are left. Like, this type of guy to me scares me as someone who trains a lot of players, because that's usually not to get too meta with this, but someone who tries to bite off a schedule that is just like almost insane amount of productivity is usually in some sort of unconscious mode of self-sabotage, where they silently know that they're going to burn out and they don't actually want to map a schedule that's sustainable for them over a long period of time, because that's uncomfortable to think about. So they try to give you like this burst of energy, like they're going to do it in this amount of short time. And I would say that guy fails very consistently, to the point where if I see that early on, I'll avoid getting involved with a student like that, because I think there's just such a low potential. I'm much more interested in the player that can take a long viewpoint and be like, okay, I'm in this for a year or two, and this is how much I'm going to study over that amount of time, and this is what I'm going to do it, and it's going to be in these increments. I like to see that. As someone who struggled with organization all through my 20s and sort of just got it handled this year after going through a lot of cycles of not having a consistent schedule, I see the value now in being able to do a little bit of work a day. Like, that 2 hours of study a day really, really adds up if you stay consistent with it. And then, 3 months down the road, you have all this work that you've accomplished from your studies, and you have a lot of stuff archived. And it feels really good to have. I think that building that type of momentum is something that really builds your confidence as a player, knowing that you are someone who studies and you are someone who's learning something new every day that you can apply to the table that day, hopefully. That's always been something that I think is a big distinguishing factor between very, very good players and amateurs.
Yeah, it's very common for people to say that if you draw 1% every day, it compounds, right? So 1% to the power of 365, it's almost 38 times. It's like 37.8 times better. And it really adds up. Like, learning compounds. I mean, people talk about money compounding all the time, but learning and relationships, a lot of other factors compound as well. So putting that time in every day really makes a big difference. And I think the point that you were trying to make, or at least what I see about poker players that try to rush too quickly into things, is that a lot of poker players, the reason that they want to study that much and to become and to go on that crazy schedule is because they can't delay gratification. And when you are somebody that cannot delay gratification, you want to kind of pack everything in really quickly and work super, super hard, like with a short burst of energy, even though you will burn out. And
Right.
you are the same kind of person that actually doesn't really want to study. That's why you want to do it all at one go.
Right. You can't stand studying deep down. So you try to convince yourself that you're going to get all your studying done by working these insane hours, but really you're setting yourself up for a long-term failure. You're going to burn out, basically. There's another thing I'd like to offer here for guys who are trying to increase volume, because that's increase the amount of hands that you play per month, for instance. It's a huge problem industry-wide. It's probably the biggest issue we run across with the guys we train. And it's something I struggle with too. Like, if I'm not... So, okay, I'll give an example of what's going on with my students and what's going on with me. My students are most of my students are at that amateur level. where they're really trying to take the career seriously enough to make it work for them as professionals, which means a lot of them have etched out that they're going to study. I think most of them do study, but then a lot of them run into problems with playing volume. I would say that's the bigger problem on my team. My guys all study together, but then when the numbers come in at the end of the month, we see that many guys have volume issues with not being able to play enough hands, which is a problem if you're trying to make more money, because clearly your hourly rate is what dictates, the amount of hours you play is what dictates your monthly income. So for me, on the other end of this, Wayne, you looked at my schedule and told me I need to take some stuff off of it. I'm like almost overwhelmed with projects right now, and I'm still trying to play on the side. So for me, it's very easy to not play on a day because my other projects get in the way. And I justify it by being like, oh, but I did all this stuff today. I don't need to worry about the fact that I didn't play. And then at the end of the month, you see like, well, that resulted in me playing way less hands that I planned on. So what's the solution? I think I've read this a lot of places. I really feel strongly that having accountability to other people, whether or not it should work like this, it seems to work. Get a group of friends. So hopefully you've got some other guys that that play poker. What we did for my team was we had everybody start the month and say, okay, we want you guys to pick a volume goal, an amount of hands that is 150% of the most you've ever played in a month. So it's kind of like a pretty hard goal for them to make, because it's significantly more than they've ever done. So everybody posts it, and to see, this is the first month we're doing it, but like to see the amount of guys that are on track with this goal, because the team is there basically, holding them accountable in the chat room for it, and everybody's having to post weekly updates. It's very, very interesting. And I think the difference is that if you have the goal in mind and you're really locked in, and you have that accountability to others, which is a big thing. Like they even told me, they're like, Nick, if we're doing this, you need to make a goal too. And so I was like, okay, like I'll do 100 hours this month. I've got a lot of other stuff going on, but I'm going to do 100 hours of play. And so I'm in this group with them. And for me, the biggest thing has been just knowing that now that I have that target, I know how many hours a day I need to play. And in my mind, it's like, that is now the most important thing. That is the most important thing for my bottom line. And it's almost like these hands get played today or everything else ends. It's almost the mentality behind it. Yeah. It's almost like completely tunnel vision. And I think as a professional, you need to have that prioritized for yourself. Like you need to know that the most important thing is that I get my studies and my play done, and everything else in my day is built around that. Which leads into your point about like, some guys have different schedules. If you've got a family, this might be harder. But I do think it's important for you to know not just not just how much you're going to play, but really to map out, when am I going to play, and to get on that schedule and not make exceptions, because as soon as you start to slip, it's very, very hard to get back on track toward a goal.
All right, let me go here. I have a lot to say about clocking hours and how you can get more hours in. I'm pretty much making a whole course, like a personal development course, non-poker one, about building habits, increasing your discipline levels, or rather hacking your discipline levels so that you get more work done. And generally, like the accountability thing that you said is a big one. It's a big forcing function that is there that encourages people to play. And there are many other forcing functions. Like when it comes to playing a lot of volume, right? It's really about getting into the habit of playing a lot of volume, and how you create that habit. Firstly, you need a lot of triggers. You need a lot of things to remind you that you need to play. And when it comes to forcing functions, the accountability, having accountability partners, people that you don't need to motivate them to be your accountability partners, but people that are already motivated themselves. When these people are there and you are holding each other accountable, it becomes very easy to clock in the volume. And for live poker players, it's actually very different. Where the problems that you are talking about studying too much, I think it's very likely because you have a team dynamic with your team, where all of your CFP students, they feel like they're part of a team and they are doing their studies as part of a team. So the studying part, there is the forcing function because they're all studying together and they're holding each other accountable to the studies. It's also interesting because they're not doing it themselves. But if they weren't part of a team or if they were a live player, the opposite problem actually exists,
Too
where
much
people
play.
just go and play live because their friends are at the casino. They just show up, go to the casino and play, and they don't spend any time studying at all.
Hmm.
So there is kind of a little bit of a difference.
Can
And
can you talk to me about the triggers that you use? I want to hear like what are your triggers that you use to remind yourself to play
well,
in your playing days?
so in Macau, the trigger is very simple. Everybody in Macau just always puts their name on the list, because when you put your name on the list, like you always have a chance to be in a good game with a big VIP. And when you put your name on the list, right, you get a text. You have 20 minutes to get your seat. Then you're kind of forced to go down to see if there is a VIP. And if the VIP is there, you play. If you get a seat, oftentimes you already dressed up, you're already in the casino, you're like, all right, I guess I'll play.
Right.
And it's a kind of an environment that created that very high volume play thing. But me personally, how I actually played more hands or studied more is to stack habits. So habit stacking is when you stack a new habit that you want to add on top of an old habit that you already have. For example, if you wanted to do more push-ups, you could stack that on top of making your coffee. So every time you make your coffee, you do push-ups. So like sooner or later, that coffee becomes a trigger for you to start doing that push-ups. So if you
Nice.
wanted to play more online, you could say like, hey, after I work out in the gym and I take a shower, I'm not going to go to my phone. I'm not going to do anything. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play. And that's my only goal. I'm going to start playing. I don't need to. James Clear talks about this in his book Atomic Habits, where you don't need to have a very big playing goal at that time. You don't say like, oh, I'm going to shower and I'm going to play 3 hours of poker. Tell yourself, hey, I'm going to shower and I'm going to fire up at least one table of poker and play. And then when
So
you fire up that one table of poker, you're like, if you're somebody that plays 5 tables, you're like, why am I only playing one? I might as well fire up five. And once you start playing, you're like,
I'm here.
I
I'm
guess
gonna
I'm
play.
playing.
But talk to me about what's actually happening there. What's the science behind that? There's like a neural pathway getting connected that you're gonna do that thing right after the last thing.
So basically, if you understand how habits form, right? Habits, there are three parts to it. This is from the Power of Habit, where the first part is the trigger, the second part is the extra action, and the third part is the reward. So habits form because there are these three parts. And if you have problems getting, if you have problems actually taking the action, it's usually because there are not enough triggers or there is not a good enough reward for yourself. And the triggers, like habit stacking is one way for you to get a lot of triggers in, because if every time you make that coffee, immediately after that you start playing a session, it becomes like, oh, I made a coffee, it's time to play the session. It's like there's no gap in between for you to think
Nice,
about.
nice. It's the gap that's the problem then. Because it's the
Yeah.
gap that lets you like pick up your phone and get distracted and then go rationalize to do something else. So what are some rewards that you use for yourself?
Well, I mean, personally, if you're talking about poker, it's very hard for me to be very specific about the kinds of rewards that I use, because I wasn't aware so much of how this works when I was playing poker.
Sure. So just okay, in terms of your general productivity, when do you give yourself, how frequently are you rewarding yourself? Or is it just something that happens naturally when you feel like you're getting a lot of work done?
Yeah, well, for me, it isn't exactly a particular like external reward that I give myself. It's really an internally driven reward, where if I do my work and I am productive, or I go and have that workout, I feel good after, and that is
Nice.
the reward.
Cool. I think that's got to be the healthiest way. Like, I know there's a difference when my head hits the pillow at night if I know that I stayed on my schedule that day. There's something different about the feeling when you go to bed at night and then you wake up the next morning feeling like you have momentum. I never wanted to, it's a hard thing to quantify, but like it's feeling it is knowing it, I think. Like feeling the boost of having momentum, it's definitely a real thing.
Yeah, one suggestion I have for your team is, if they have volume goals where they struggle to actually clock the hours, right, is to actually have like a grind hour, where let's say it is 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific time. And these are the grind hours. Everybody is going to grind during these hours. And it is kind of like, hey, this is the time where everybody just fires in and grinds. I mean, if they're
Yeah.
playing the same sites, then it's a little bit more complicated than that. But like maybe within small teams of people that play different stakes, like, hey,
Or at different time zones. Yeah, that too.
yeah,
Yeah, I like that idea because that's like that's like having accountability to others squared almost. Like we
yeah,
have not only do we have accountability to each other, but we're actually going to play at the same time every day, almost in sync. Hopefully they don't find themselves playing against each other because that's a bit counterproductive.
there's another thing to be said about, like, finding that motivation to play. There is two parts to it. When have been talking a lot about the externally driven motivating factors, where you are driven by external things around you, like your environment, your habits, your accountability partners. But there's also the other part about it being internally driven. Like, why are you playing? Why is it important for you to play?
Right.
Why do you want to get to where you want to go? And being really clear about knowing your whys actually helps you to. It's kind of like something to fall back on when you don't feel like playing, but you have that strong reason why you need to play. Maybe
Yeah,
you want to take care of somebody.
I think that is I don't want to say it's a more advanced level of mindset work, but it does take longer to map that. Like usually someone can't just figure that out in a day. Yet when someone does figure out that why on a deep level, I think it really connects the dots and drags you forward through the motions for whatever reason. Like I think I really only got clear on that in the last 6 months where I could say, okay, I know where I'm headed with this in 3 years in terms of just like understanding performance training on a better level. And poker is the pathway to that. And I've got to do these things before I can get to where I want to be. Once I saw that, it was much easier for me to accept that, like, okay, I'm going to have to do these things to actually get there, as opposed to doing them without really a clear idea of why, except that I wanted to make money. And I think this is, like we said at the beginning, that making money would be one primary motivation for people. And I think on a certain level that works to motivate you to choose the career. But I also think, almost paradoxically, it's very, very important to repair your motivational system. I think that's the terminology that I've heard some mindset coaches use for it, so that money is not the sole driver. I think it's much more important to have an intrinsic motivator, like, I want to make this money so that I can open up a wider performance company and help people learn better. Something like this. It doesn't have to be that. It can be anything really, but something that is tangible, that drags you forward through the process, that stands for a deeper, it has to feel purposeful to you. That's the biggest part. Whatever that why is, it has to have purpose to you beyond just the financial achievement.
Yeah. I guess will probably be a good place to wrap up.
I'm really glad that we went off on this rant though, because we didn't plan on talking about this, but I didn't know that you were that into it, and I definitely learned something about the triggers. So I think I'm actually going to go do 10 push-ups and fire up some tables now.
Nice.
In the spirit of this.
I'll hold you accountable and leave the video on after you do the 10 push-ups.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'll share screens.
All right. I'll catch you again, Nick. Bye.
Yeah, this was a good one. Thanks, Wayne.